All right, we're live. So
Hello.
I'll give a quick intro of myself. I'm the Austrian on iFunny. You guys want to introduce yourselves?
Hold up. Before we continue, Connor, you're like destroying my ears with static. There, that's better. Oh, wait. Now it's better. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Wait, so
Okay.
you want to do an intro of your iFunnies?
I don't really use iFunny anymore. I mean, you can probably still find me on there. It's Calamitous Prophecy, and I'm not active anymore, but I can introduce myself. I'm an objectivist. That means I mostly follow at least the philosophy of Ayn Rand. I'm a minarchist. I think government is necessary, but don't worry, I'm a libertarian still. And yeah, I'm into politics, economics, and philosophy and stuff like that.
Connor, you want to introduce yourself next?
All right, yeah. This is Fantasy from iFunny, and I too am objectivist, therefore minarchist. Please be advised that I also agree with any opposers of objectivism purely on the basis of Ayn Rand as a person. She is not the best objectivist, and I think Calamitous has the same position. But yeah, so right-wing libertarian, minarchist, and yeah, there we go.
So I'll just throw out there that I'm a Hoppian anarcho-capitalist. So I kind of understand minarchism as a pragmatic stage between the eventual dissolution of the government into what would be an anarcho-capitalist society. But we'll get into that in a bit. In the meantime, do you want to bring up the question you had before, at least regarding the military? Because I think we can springboard off of that.
Yeah, so the question was about, in a minarchist state, the military being, or a national military being necessary, actually in order to wage war. The question was, is waging war sometimes necessary? And the example being situations like Pearl Harbor, in which we are attacked by a large nation or empire, basically, in Imperial Japan's instance, and just a normal militia could not take care of the duty of waging war on an entire empire. So, and therefore you run into the problem of funding for that military in a minarchy where most minarchists believe taxation is theft.
I guess just to state my position on it briefly, and then we can go to Calamitous. It's taxation is theft. I guess, though, the minarchist position, and maybe you could tell me if I'm wrong, would be that this theft comes with certain benefits that would make it so that we could live in a free society. Now, I would disagree with that and say the military may not be necessary for that, or you could have private defense firms. But I recognize so long as the state exists that the military has to exist as well, because you have to defend the interests of your citizens who have, whether willingly or unwillingly, vested some capital into it. So you're essentially just living up to a part of a contract at that point.
Yeah, see, that mainly for me, it's more of the objectivist position that taxation is theft because of our views on like property and productivity and the value you get from your labor. So
Yeah, I mean, in objectivism, it's basically, why would you let the government take anything from you? Like, what they give you no benefit and they just use your shit for other people, right? But the trade-off is, if there's a trade-off fundamentally in that, yes, the government, is inefficient with their money. They're not going to spend it on you, so why would you give it to them? But in an extension, they are necessary to make sure that you can trade with people rather than people forcing you to give up your shit to them, or rather than other people stealing from you. And this goes back to the whole thing about, you need a government for a market to exist. The government is necessary in order to make sure there's no coercion and that there's no force so that a market can exist, and a market being, somewhere where you trade shit rather than people stealing or forcing each other to give shit up, right? So there's a trade-off there where a minarchy is necessary in that you need a government to make sure you can have a market and to make sure you can have, so you can defend your freedom from other countries, like, for example, imperialist Japan and Pearl Harbor, right? But there needs to be a balance in that, they don't take your money and, tax it to oblivion to any extent they want and use it on whatever they want. So, my position is on taxation is that maybe this is a contradiction. Maybe the word shouldn't be taxation, but it's contractual, which means that, in exchange for the benefit of being able to trade without coercion being used on you, and etc., you would sign a contract which gives money to this government that has a monopoly on force, and that will be able to defend your interests in that regard. But it's a contract, so they can't basically force you to give up your money. It's not theft. It's a contract. You sign a contract, you pay the government in exchange for specific things that only help you, and you're not going to be paying for other shit. So in terms of funding, that's the objectivist position, and in terms of what the government should be doing in terms of defense and all that shit, that's the objectivist position in general, right?
Does that mean? Okay, you go ahead, Connor.
Okay, well, just to be clear, you mean monopoly on use or monopoly on retaliatory force, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And I know the standard Ancap arguments against this. It's that, well, why would you need the government to do that when you can have private industry do that? And I'll let you make that point. I'm not going to make it for you because I think it will be interesting to hear you make that point, because people have different iterations of it.
Okay, well, an interesting point you just brought up. You said it was a contract. Does that mean objectivists believe in the social contract? Is that something they hold to be philosophically valid?
Not the social contract per se. We don't think you're born into a country with an inherent contract to other people. I think that when you're of age, like whatever that might be, 16, 18, you would sign a contract with the government in order to be protected from the use of force. So there's no social contract inherent, right? You have to sign it, and it has to be the major part is that it has to be consensual, right? So you're not just forced into a contract, because then it's not contractual. That
so
would
under
be
so under an objectivist minarchy, you would actually propose that the government start having people sign contracts?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but we still believe in a government because we think it needs to be a monopoly. You can't have private industry do that for various reasons.
Okay. Well, then I guess my next question that would follow is, if people choose not to be a part of that contract and choose to live on their own in some way, shape, or form, would there be some kind of forced use to compel them into that contract? Or if, say, if the United States were to implement this policy tomorrow and people who didn't want to be a part of the United States, didn't sign the contract, would there be something like, would you force them in, or would they be able to say, would the whole state of Texas, if they wanted to, be able to leave the Union?
I think that would be fine for them to leave. I think it would be absolutely fine, but they can't expect to not have force used against them if they begin to violate the rights of the people that have the government, the monopoly on force, working with them, right? Because if they start violating, if they leave the Union, right, and they aren't under the influence of that single government, right, they can't then think that they can act outside the operation of the government and violate the rights of people that the government controls over, right? The government has the right to protect the people that are paying it to protect them, right? So Texas can't just succeed and start stealing from, the rest of the Union because they're not under the influence of the Union government in that situation. That would be wrong, and the Union government would have the right to, attack Texas in that situation and defend the rights of the people in the union.
Yeah, so essentially in this scenario, you'd have the government act as a kind of private defense firm in its own right, is essentially what you're saying, right?
Exactly, yeah. But the fundamental thing that I think is necessary is that uh, there cannot be competing firms within a single country, because if that happens, the issue that arises is that there's no objective consensus on ethics, and I believe in objective rights and etc. And if you have competing sets of ethical codes or codes of law, right, that's going to start serving specific interests within the country, right? So you'll have like one defense firm that could serve like only, I don't want to seem like a Marxist, but I'll just use this example. You have one that only serves the rich, but it could be anything. It could be like only serves the white race, right? And then you would have this collectivist kind of ethics where you have competing sets of ethics that serve specific interests rather than an objective set of ethics that serves the rights of everybody equally. What's important is equality before the law, right? So you can't have competing governments, because then you don't have an objective set of ethics that everybody is. You get the point. I'm not going to go on.
That would make sense within an Ancap society as well. As I mean, you really wouldn't be able to have a contract with more than one defense term. And I suppose my biggest argument against what you're proposing, seeing that it is like literally just a hop, skip, and a jump away from an Ancap society, would be that essentially what you're proposing, where the government would act as a private company, would just be horribly, horribly inefficient because of the way government is set up, or at least the form of governments we know now, which is a hyper-inclusive mass bureaucratic democracy, which would be incredibly inefficient on action, and laws could be arbitrarily passed into will that might violate rights. But I suppose if you're having everyone signing a contract to agree to this defense firm in the first place, so long as that violation of rights is consensual, I guess it wouldn't be inherently violating the NAP or anything like that.
Well, yeah, that's the premise, right? You stick to the NAP, right? There's no aggression in the government's operation, and you have a single government. It might be inefficient, right? I'm completely with you there. There's no market competition, so it's going to be slow. There's going to be a variety of reasons that it wouldn't be as efficient as a private firm that could like operate any other business, like a railroad, for example, right? Or
right.
You get it, right? But it's worth it, and it's necessary in order to keep an objective set of ethical premises universal, right? And that's why it's one of the reasons objectivism is called objectivism in ethics, right? Just like with all the other branches of philosophy, objectivism believes in an objective reality to ethics, and that it must be held among all people equally, equality before the law, and that's it.
Yeah, essentially what you're advocating, at least looking at it from like an ANCAP kind of perspective, is just that people agree to this one form of private security forces, which again is understandable. And relating it back to the military question, I would say that, even in this minarchist society, you'd be agreeing to fund your large defense firm, in this case, your army, via taxation already. So I don't think the funding of a military would necessarily come up as a major problem. Would you disagree, Connor?
I mean, I wouldn't disagree. Well, would I disagree with it being a problem?
Well, would you disagree that funding would be a problem? Because you've already kind of laid out that people have already agreed to pay for it via this contract.
No, actually, I'm not sure. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm not sure about Connor's stance on the contract stuff. That's pretty specific to only a few objectivists. Some objectivists just believe in straight up taxation, and some are pure voluntarists that, well, in the sense that, I didn't mean that. They're pretty much ANCAP. They think that private firms should defend everything. It can vary a lot. So I don't know about Connor's position. It's not universal to all objectivists.
I see. Okay. So would you care to elaborate on your personal position, Connor?
Okay, well, I think my position is probably minarchist because, well, minarchist, but I don't agree with forced taxation or any coercion from the government. monopoly on the use of retaliatory force, not on force in general. But again, I always run into the issue of funding. There are many solutions for that, but in general, my position is more voluntary than other objectivists who actually do believe in coerced taxation and that kind of thing.
Okay, so you would kind of subscribe to a form of voluntary taxation where the only people paying for the government would be those who would be willing to be a part of it, kind of like the contract idea?
Yes, I agree with I agree with Cal's position on contracts.
Okay, all right. So then I guess the argument from here kind of goes into whether or not, like, obviously it's been kind of conceded already that government is just inefficient when it comes to doing these kinds of things. So is it really necessary then if there are better, more efficient systems out there? Like, why? The argument would be, why not have it privatized, I suppose.
I've heard that argument a lot, right? I think when I bring up the issue of equality before the law, it really comes down to maybe we can solve it here, but it comes down to what seems like a semantic thing where one person says, why don't you think multiple private firms could hold the same, set of ethics, right? And I would say because just due to the fact that there are multiple and that they want to serve the market, right? They are going to split and serve their niches and serve the interests of the specific people that operate under their kind of area, right? And the issue with that is, as I mentioned before, you can have all sorts of terrible things happen, and to me, it doesn't seem any different from a country's just splitting up into multiple countries where each kind of firm controls its own territory with certain laws that serve certain people within those areas, right? And no longer will there be an objective set of rules that keep everybody's rights in objective, right? You'll have different states where maybe in the state of Texas they decided that white supremacy was the best, right? So in the state of Texas, right, that firm defends the fact that all black people are inferior and therefore should be slaves, right? And then up in maybe Canada, right, that becomes Ancap 2, right? All of Canada decides that they want to be an Islamic state, right? So they ban all other religions, right?
It's getting there. It's getting there.
Yeah, exactly, right? I'm actually Canadian. They passed a law recently to ban, freedom of speech.
I heard about that.
Anyway, but this is all radical stuff, right? It wouldn't start off this radical, but different firms would drift to protect different sets of moral rules and laws and etc. And you'd have basically, nothing different from Europe, for example, where you have drastically different laws in England and Russia, where in Russia you can't be, gay or have freedom of speech, and in England, different freedom of speech is restricted in reference to Islam and stuff like that, right? So yeah, that's the argument objectivists have against the kind of private firm thing, right? Is inherently when you have multiple governments in quotes, because you're calling them firms, right, operating in a state, it's no different than just having multiple different moral laws governing over different people, and that's a problem for us.
Well, okay, I'd have a couple responses to that. The first of which being, when nations have different laws, there isn't a direct contract, at least of now, with a nation. So you could argue that the people who have living in those areas have not consented to those laws, and so they didn't have anything to do with them, and they're being forced on them even against their own will. Whereas if you were to have multiple competing firms covering, say, a larger territory, that agreement on what would make up the law would have to be consensual. It would have to be, everybody in that area would have to agree on it, or else that firm wouldn't be hired at all. And, with that comes the idea that there would be varying interpretations of law.
You're cutting off. It's like staticky.
Hold on.
Okay, I can hear you now. Yeah.
You can hear me now?
Yeah.
Where did I leave off?
And you just cut off again. Hello?
Wait, can you not hear me?
I can hear you now. It's cutting off.
That's weird. I hope it's not my internet.
Oh wait, okay. I
Let
think
me-
you're good now. I think you're good now. You cut off. I think you were saying something about multiple conserve the interests of specific groups or something like that.
Yeah, so if you were to have multiple groups, you'd know that each group had to be consenting to whatever that firm was offering. Otherwise, they wouldn't have hired that firm in the first place. There would be a direct contract you could go back to, unlike in the case of current states. And then the other case would be interpretations of a law isn't necessarily bad, so long as you have people who are able to move as well. Now, obviously, it's private property, so you're not necessarily free to move wherever you please. But if you're, say, interested in buying land somewhere, nobody's going to deny you the right, or any economic person wouldn't deny you the right to move somewhere necessarily.
I can't hear you. It keeps dropping out. I hope maybe it's my side. Hopefully, it's not affecting the stream.
There's one person watching. One person in chat. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you now. Yeah, it's just weird. It gets like you sound like a robot.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Then I don't think that's my internet because my phone is still connected and stuff. And normally, when my internet gets spotty, my phone connection drops out. But I'll summarize this really quickly.
I can hear you fine.
You can hear me, Connor?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay, it could be me then.
Okay.
Just continue. I'll try to deal with it.
So having multiple interpretations isn't necessarily bad because you give the people the option to decide on what they want is the best interpretation, because the only way one interpretation becomes dominant is through market consent, really. If a certain group of people like this set of rules, they'll go with X firm, and if the other group of people like X or Y rules, they'll go with Y firm. And so through that process of what people like, either the majority will come to an agreement on one larger set of rules, or they'll just stay in their own little territories. And should they never cross each other, should they never go into each other's territory and violate each other's rights, it wouldn't necessarily be a problem. Kind of like you were stating before, like unless Texas decided to loot the rest of the union, it's not going to be a problem.
I think that's actually a very good point, and that's the premise that the states in the United States were based on, right? It was based on the presence on the premise that each state would have separate kind of laws, and if somebody has a problem with the laws in California, right, they would have the freedom to move to a different state that has different laws, and then it basically increases freedom in a sense, decreases kind of a universal set of rules, and people can be free. But the difference between that system and the system that you're talking about is that there's a federal government that still prevents people from having, certain disputes that would cause further issues than that. Because what you're forgetting is that in terms of ethics, right, it's not just reflective, right? So it's not just, right, it's not just I want to be a Muslim, right? Therefore, I'm going to operate under this Islamic firm that's going to defend my rights, right? Under certain ethical systems like Islam, right, people are going to want to force others to convert to their religion, or under ethical systems like white supremacist ones, they are going to think that black people are inferior and might declare war on another firm that protects like a Black Lives Matter kind of group, right? So the issue is when you have different kind of firms defending different kind of rights, right, you have basically different gangs of people, right, fighting other gangs formed for the same purpose, that is defending the individual interests of different groups, right? And you end up with basically perpetual gang rule in different areas, right? Society provides no organized protection against force. Each citizen is, compelled, therefore, to either go around armed or pay one of these firms or gangs to defend their interests, right? And it basically becomes tribal warfare, right? Whatever ethical system or whatever firm that defends a certain ethical system is strongest, right, will become dominant, right? So
Okay.
your idea about this kind of state thing would work perfectly, right? If there was a federal government that enforced a set of rules and forced all the states to stay together and prevented war and etc. But you're advocating for no governments at all, right?
Okay.
And the problem would be there would be inevitable conflict.
So, okay, I guess this is the part of the conversation where I have to inevitably mention private courts. And so to address your first part, like say someone wanted to live under, hired an Islamic firm to enforce some sort of really strict Sharia kind of law, or lived under some kind of white supremacist firm where they tried to, make African American slaves again. In order to get a firm to do that, everybody in that group would have to consent to that. And so I doubt any African American, ethnicity would consent. If in that neighborhood, that firm just couldn't get hired. Then in the second case, if something like that did go through in some geographical area, then people would just avoid it. It would stop being traded. And if people found it objectionable enough, but assuming I just noticed something wonky with our stream. It just went offline a little bit. Can you?
Everything good?
I think so. I think. Okay, something just went.
I didn't hear a lot of what you said, but I think from in between the robot sounds, I think I made out your argument. Regardless.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what's up. I don't know. I can't say it's my internet on my part, but I keep seeing that my live stream, it stops going live every couple seconds, like a full 30 seconds behind. But whatever, I'll finish making my point. Then the other part of that would be, this is where private courts come in. You would go to if two defense firms were to go to war, you'd go to arbitration of a certain court that is agreed upon. And obviously, firms wouldn't agree upon a court that was obviously biased in one person's favor or the other. And so, because if they did, they'd know it's a bad deal. And the reason they'd agree to go to a court is because fighting is simply just not efficient. The loss of life, the property damage, it's just not an efficient way of running any kind of business.
This makes some assumptions I don't like, because you're assuming that it's in the interests of what you're talking about, interests, right? It might not be in the interest of one faction to go to war, but would it be in the interest of the faction to go to a court that would probably side with the other one if they're being unjust, or if they believe that the court thinks they're being unjust? I mean, in every single case, eventually. Well, yeah, in every single case, though, to each faction, the court is going to be biased towards one, because the court's going to make a decision eventually, right? And if one
making a decision isn't necessarily biased, it's taking you have a precedent. Like, obviously, in the beginning, it would be a case of trying to feel out which judges gave the best cases, but eventually, the judges would have a precedent set for themselves, where you go to this judge if you want the best decision made, if you want the fairest ruling made. And even if it's not in your favor, if this judge is one with a reputation for fairness, you're just not going to question what he says, really, because you know what he says is fair.
I'm not sure if I'm willing to rely on the premise that, first of all, right, people are all rational beings that will act in accordance with their interests perfectly, right? Because your assumption is that, okay, these factions are going to be defending people who won't want war, right?
Keep going, sorry.
There will be inevitable situations where they will want war, and they think that it's ethical to want war and efficient to want war. And in those cases, right, that won't apply, right? And I think even further than that, right, each firm that protects a certain ethical perspective, like let's say there's a fascist firm and there's a communist firm, and they defend people who one group defends, these people who think
communists in my Ancapistan.
It's possible, right? You have these firms protecting individual interests, right?
Oh, I suppose it is.
Yeah. What if they both decide that they're both going to believe that they are right, right? That they are absolutely right and that the other one is evil, inevitable, right? So to have an unbiased quote unquote court, right, side with one isn't going to change the minds of another group of people who morally think that fascism is evil and they deserve to fall and die, and they believe that the people that are under that firm are simply misguided and need to be basically freed from their, Nazi chains, right? So I think there are a few ideas that are wrong here, which is one of them being every single person does not have a sense of an objective set of ethics that is true and right. They're not going to accept a judge just telling them that something is right, and they're not going to just, let what they see as evil, right, continue to happen. This is a question of ethics, not just practicality, right? And in some cases, what might not seem practical at first, right, will seem practical once somebody prescribes that something is evil, right? So sure, it might not be practical to one person to stop, a genocide across the entire world, right? But if they suddenly adopt an ethical system that says that not interfering would be evil, well, now guess what? They're obligated to interfere because not interfering to them would be evil, regardless of what anybody tells them. I hope my point was put across. I hope you can hear me. I don't know if my internet's still shit.
No, that's fine. I heard you well. So this is, I guess, the point I would make to that. So you're assuming that there are two factions of people who have hired defense firms who just want to go to war with each other no matter what, and arbitration really wouldn't matter.
Yeah, because there's no objective set of ethics. They just believe in different things, right?
Yeah, so and what would kind of happen in this situation? Either you would have, the firm who's going to war, either they would have the full backing of the people, and the people, no matter how great the cost, would continue to go to war, and eventually they would just kind of
let's not use the
wear
people.
them.
That sounds a bit communist.
Well, I mean, you mentioned communists being one of the factions, so
that's true. Yeah, that's okay. Sure, yeah.
I mean, let's just say
I think a more appropriate term would be the shareholders, because truly that is
sure. That's a good point.
Yeah, all right. Let's say the shareholders, the investors, whoever, are fully behind this firm and they're fully behind this war, no matter what the cost. Economically speaking, it's just not going to be a sustainable effort, no matter how much prior activity they have, and they are eventually.
But now you're talking in practicality again, which is completely a perfect. Like if you are thinking in only market terms, right? If you're thinking
this doesn't even apply. Doesn't even apply necessarily to the singular firm of their own economic situation. Outside forces are not going to want to trade with a war that is a firm that is with a firm that's constantly at war. It's not a feasible option in any sensible way. It's because they know they're just going to waste resources.
Keynesian. You mentioned communist firms, and then I guess you could also include Keynesian firms, because they're the ones who would want to trade with other firms who are constantly at war, huh?
I mean, I don't know. It's just, see, you can't have a Keynesian anarcho-capitalist state. It just wouldn't work, because people would stop trusting a central bank that, even if it were consensual, would that just continue to devalue its currency? That could not survive on its own.
Well, you say that, but I mean, how many people today support a central bank despite the fact that they devalue their currency? Right. This idea that people are all rational, right? Reason, I agree. Reason and these objective set of ethics, they are correct.
People are rational. It's kind of more of a business decision, because eventually, most of the people who use central banks aren't aware of what the central banks are doing. Like it's a great kind of conspiracy in that sense. Although, even though all the information is public, people choose not to educate themselves on it. The people who actually do the investing in the banks, like the big Goldman Sachs type folks, they're going to know what's going on. So they're the ones who are going to stop investing in this firm. And then that's just how it's going to stop. But I'll get back to your point where, two firms just going to war with each other. And let's assume somehow they're able to sustain it indefinitely, and they're indifferent to the ruling of a judge. Well,
which I assume they would be. I assume they would be indifferent to the judge if they think the other one is being evil, right?
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, you're right. They would be indifferent to a judge. That's my question. Is what? Okay, so you have a ruling from a private court, but
I mean, yeah, and,
What
and sorry, I
what
don't mean to
gives
interrupt. It's just this is bothering me so much. Just this one thing, right? You're saying that there, this thing with the judge. You're implying there's an objective set of ethics that everybody's following. That this
Yes,
judge
it would
is
be natural law.
well. See, that's my point though. You can have natural the rights would exist, but people don't have to affirm these rights, and they can make up their own rights and just have a firm protect those. So the idea that
Well,
everybody's going to
people
just
can
follow
contractually
this.
choose to surrender those rights if they want to, but again, it has to be consensually agreed upon that they do surrender those rights.
Well, I'll respond to that in a second. Anyway, I'll just let Connor continue because I feel bad for interrupting him. It's just I had to. Yeah.
Well, my question for that is with the private courts has always been what makes if it's all voluntary, what makes, or actually, I'm probably going to answer my own question, but if it's all voluntary, what makes the firms, what makes these companies obey by the judge's decision? But I guess they sign a contract at the beginning, right?
Yeah, that is kind of the case. They'd follow the contract in the beginning. That's what I forgot to mention in the beginning, and thank you for bringing it up. Actually, these firms would be contractually bound to that one judge they agreed upon in the first place, and then if they were to break the contract, what the judge would then have some kind of authority to do is he would bring in another defense firm, and essentially it would become a case of 2v1 or some other firm, and there would be some other form of justice, or they would appeal to some other private court, the firm that's continually being invaded, and they could get help like that. And so even though this one firm continues and that one firm has broken their contract, they've broken their contract, and now all rules are off against them. And essentially, maybe there was some kind of civilized standard between the war proceedings before they decided to take it to the court. Now it's no holds bars because they've totally tossed aside their side of the contract.
Well, see, that's where an objectivist society comes in handy with the whole contract thing, because most objectivists believe that the government should also be in the business of enforcing contracts and I guess maybe or fining people for breaking contracts in the business worlds, and that's also what keeps mutual trade going, is government protecting contracts.
Well, again, I'm not quite sure why the defense firms can't protect their own contracts or have a larger defense firm before the defense firms, a defense firm, so to speak.
But isn't that it's just circular, and it can go on forever until you have defense firms for the defense firms for the defense firms for whatever, however many times it goes, and it's just so inefficient that way.
Well, no, there's someone breaking a contract somewhere in there, and someone definitely in the wrong. And the firm that wants to make money will follow its contract, and therefore it will enforce the part of the contract where it agreed to stop anyone who broke their contract. And you're right, it would kind of be circular, but you wouldn't necessarily need multiple levels. You would just have multiple firms policing each other. It would be a society it would essentially be one massive society where mutually assured destruction would be the rule of the land, so to speak.
So what you're saying, like, what is the difference between, first of all, I think the fundamental issue here is that we are still not establishing that there would be a universal objective set of ethics in an anarcho-capitalist society. From what I don't mean to, I mean, from what I'm hearing, you have accepted the fact that there wouldn't be, actually, so that you would have these different firms. You would have a firm that would serve fascists, for example, or a firm that would serve communists, and that would be fine because they're serving their individual interests, right? But
well, you would have natural order, and in order for anybody to break that natural law, if you wanted to break that, it would have to be through a consensual contract. So there is a universal code of ethics, so to speak, but people can choose to break that at will if they want. But they have to choose to do it.
Well, I agree with you. There is a universal set of objective ethics. Perhaps what I mean, there is no universal enforcement of that. Is that a better way for me to put it?
Yes, between various different anarcho-capitalist firms, there wouldn't be a defense. There wouldn't be one.
So that is more the objectivist position. Obviously, I think we can all agree that there are natural rights per se, right? The issue is in this anarcho-capitalist society, there's no kind of universal law that basically enforces it, right? That makes people respect those rights and those moral standards, right? And we've been kind of avoiding the question of how do we have an objective set of ethics in a society where law, that which enforces ethics, is up to market forces? And I just want you to answer that. Let's kind of skip all this crap about circular arguments with firms protecting firms. How about we just answer that question, because I think that's the fundamental one.
Eventually, if you were to ask, I think Murray Rothbard set this out in Power and Market quite nicely, I think, is that natural law would be the most efficient. If you were to have a society in which some natural rights were abridged, it just wouldn't be as efficient as where the individual is as free to do as they want. So eventually, any firms that, even if they consensually agreed to abridge some kind of rights, even if you did have some kind of contractual Keynesian anarcho state or some kind of communist anarcho state, these are just places that through one inefficiency or another would die out, and the market would dictate that natural liberties would flourish, essentially. So the market would, even though people would have other self-interests, their self-interests would essentially just die out because they're not economically efficient. Does that answer it?
I didn't hear most of it. Can I? Okay. I only heard a few words, actually, like maybe 4 or 5 words. I'm gonna try to
Connor,
think
did you
about
get that?
Okay, wait. I think your argument was probably that since following natural law, since it is the real natural kind of, since it's the true ethics, right? Following it will be the most productive for people that do. Eventually, market forces will, destroy all other types of ethics, and that will reign as the, superior ethics. Is that probably?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Eventually, it's like market survival of the fittest. Any abridgment of natural liberties will prove to be economically inefficient, and they will eventually wither away.
I still could not hear. So okay, I'm actually going.
You were right. You were right. You were right in your assessment.
Okay, so that is your assumption. Okay, I heard you say yes there. Okay, so that's actually a very good point. I think that while that is true, right, that natural law is the best for each individual operating in a society, right? Again, we're operating on this assumption, right? And Ayn Rand specifically completely rejects this idea that everybody is a rational being, right? She thinks that there will always be people, okay, who will be irrational, right? Who will not be producers, right? And the issue is that people who are producers, that are rational, that do believe in natural law, right, need to have a government to protect themselves and have a market so that they can trade without worrying about force and coercion, right? So I agree with you that in the case, right, that every single person had the ability to rationalize to the degree that they could realize that the most productive thing that they could have is a firm that protects natural law, right? In that case, I would think that you're absolutely right. But I don't think that people are that reliable. I don't think people are that rational. I think there are plenty of dumb people in the world. And I think that, because, firms are rightfully self-interested, they will be willing to defend the interests of dumb people, whether they be rich, whether they be white supremacists, whether they be communists, right? So again, this comes down to the fundamental difference between objectivists and anarcho-capitalists in this regard. You guys have a lot more faith in humanity, I guess, in that you guys think that before any drastic things could happen, before gang warfare could break out, right? People will realize. Sure, I'll let you go.
No problem. I wanted to cut in just for a brief second. You're using dumb and unproductive here synonymously, right? Because you said firms would want to protect the interests of the dumb, even if they were rich or poor, no matter what, right? That was your statement, yes? All right. Oh, can you not hear me? No, can you not hear me?
I guess he can't. I heard you, but I was meaning to butt in. Hayek once said that the fact that we have seen millions voting themselves into complete dependence on a tyrant has made our generation understand that to choose one's government is not necessarily to secure freedom. And I think that can very much apply to your idea of like survival of the fittest in markets. I mean, in countries in the last 100 years that have had democracy and have had the ability to elect their leaders, yet we've had so many governments who have not followed any objective rights. And I just think I worry that that will also happen in the market, because I think at least nowadays, possibly the majority of people, at least in the United States or maybe Canada, if put in a situation like an anarcho-capitalist society where they have to choose the ethics of different firms, I don't think it will eventually lead to the right ones.
Well, that's interesting because it's kind of a similar point I was going to bring up to you, because protection from force and the force of the dumb on, through this defense firm acted through government, really through the process of voting. Because if we're saying the dumb and the unproductive are synonymous here, well, the unproductive have less money, then they're going to have much less of the stake in this defense firm, and so they won't really have much of the decision-making power.
Well,
that's
can I
one
just
of the
interject here for 1 second? I can actually hear you guys now, which is nice. So I want to get my word in before I can't hear anything you guys are saying.
Yes, please finish up.
So I think, first of all, I'm assuming that as an ANCAP, you're obviously against democracy, right?
It is a highly inefficient system.
And I'm guessing you think democracy, yeah, okay, it's highly inefficient, right? So what you're saying, I'm sure you understand this market term. In the free market, competition works off a basis of what's called market democracy. And every time you make a purchase, right, for one product as opposed to a different product, right, you are voting in a certain way for that kind of business as opposed to another business that is producing the same thing or something similar, or something basically that can compete with that product, right? So when you kind of rely on this market democracy in ideas, right, in morals, right, you're basically you're applying democracy, right, you're still applying democracy to morality and to law, right? You're just doing it through kind of a veil. You're doing it through this kind of the secret way where you call it the free market instead of democracy.
I see what you're trying to do here, but there's a very distinct difference, and that is in democracy, everybody has one vote, regardless of their skill, regardless of their qualifications, regardless of their ability to do X, Y, and Z. And so democracy is sort of this forced equality in deciding a governmental outcome, where in market democracy, there's this distinct difference of you have in the market democracy, or the more capital you have to throw around at the goods you want to see thrive. You have that because you've been able to offer something. You yourself have been skilled in some service or at producing some good, and now have accrued enough capital to actually make a difference in the tide of the market, which is something you don't have in a democracy. So unlike pure democracy like we see in something like the United States today, or like the Athenian direct democracy, there is the smart have far more power. It's almost like Plato's philosopher kings he put forth in the Republic, only instead of just being appointed through divine right or through debate or however the methodology he used. I haven't actually read the book, but whatever he proposes for the philosopher kings, the smartest people will end up, the philosopher kings will eventually emerge, so to speak, only in the form of, business tycoons or someone who have all gotten to their positions voluntarily through selling a good or a service that people have actually wanted, through being, good businessmen and offering something to the people.
Okay, yeah, I got it. You're starting to cut off a bit, so I actually don't know if you're still talking.
You're good. You're good.
I hope you're not still talking. But I mean, there are problems obviously with the philosopher king thing. I think I heard you say that they, their rise would be voluntary, so it wouldn't be like a dictatorship kind of philosopher king kind of thing. I don't know if you actually mentioned that, but I thought I heard you say something like that.
Yes,
so
I did.
Okay, I heard you say yes. Okay, good. So I think that, and you are going off something I said earlier, which maybe I shouldn't have said, which is I equated productivity with being rational, right? And if you look, I think that's a fundamentally incorrect thing that I did, because productivity and rationality are not necessarily they don't necessarily come together. And I'm sure Connor knows, and anybody, I don't think many people are watching the stream, but if people are, and you've read Atlas Shrugged, right, you know that two of the main characters who are seen as protagonists, right, throughout the whole book, specifically Hank Rearden and Dagny Taggart, right, they actually end up being antagonists, because throughout much of the novel, because despite them being productive, they're irrational and they're supporting people who just want to basically be parasites and steal from them, right? So you have people like Bill Gates, who I wouldn't consider rational. He's rich, very rich. You have many people who lobby the government and etc., right? Millionaires, very productive people that have created things for society, who don't have the same ethical system as somebody who purely rational in terms of studying ethics would have, right? Again, you'd call this a pragmatic kind of way of refuting anarcho-capitalism, but I think this all relies too much on the idea that that the best ideas will always succeed, and I think that's invalid, and I think that people that it assumes too much of people. And before I let you respond to that, there's actually a really interesting quote I want to read here. Maybe you can respond to this as well. Let me just find it. Suppose Mr. Smith, a customer of Government A, suspects that his next door neighbor, Mr. Jones, a customer of Government B, has robbed him. A squad of Police A proceeds to Mr. Jones's home and is met at the door by a squad of Police B, who declare that they do not accept the validity of Mr. Smith's complaint and do not recognize the authority of Government A. What happens then? You take it from there, right? Which is actually in the quote, right?
Mm-hmm.
This was by it's called. Let me just look. The book is called The Virtue of Selfishness. So maybe you can respond to that and my original point, and I think that would be interesting.
Okay, so I think you're doing something interesting here, because I don't think I think you're conflating rationality with irrationality with being illogical. Because I disagree with your claim that people don't always do what's best for them. Because I think in giving away money, what Bill Gates is actually doing is he's building publicity, which I believe he thinks in the long run will earn him more money through the good press than he has just given away to the poor. So I think in giving away money, he's not actually being irrational. I think he's being even more rational, so to speak, because he's building up that goodwill and that good publicity, which will eventually bring in more customers and more business to him.
Well,
Now,
Bill Gates is doing it because he feels guilty that he's so much wealthier than other people, and he has said that many times, that he gives back to charity because he feels like he doesn't deserve it, and he's I mean, you may be right that it may all end up being for publicity, but at least what he's stated, he says he's doing it because he feels guilty.
okay, I don't necessarily believe that makes him irrational, though, because sometimes even irrationality isn't necessarily what's economically the best for us. It's what makes us feel the best. And I don't think people who choose some kind of spiritual pleasure or some kind of being, a hermetic monk or anything like that, they're not being irrational by not choosing what's economically beneficial to them. They're just choosing a different life of happiness, so to speak. After all, benefits are all subjective in these terms. I know we'd like to try to quantify them in terms of economic outputs, but sometimes people just don't do that. Now, in terms of, Evan, can you restate some of your original point? Because we've gotten a little bit off base here. Just state what you kind of had at the beginning.
Absolutely. Basically, I'm saying that I don't think the most productive people are going to be the most rational or logical or specifically morally virtuous, right? I think that people are going to act in their self-interest sometimes and take priority in that, right? Which is a valid thing to do in some cases, right? If nobody is going to restrict them from acting on those interests, right? And when it comes to equality before the law, normally that would be fine in a free market where they're not using any force, right? But when it comes to firms and the use of force and moral law, that becomes a problem because now you have these productive people essentially deciding which firms are going to be in power, right? So whoever makes the most money based on being productive, right? So, they have worked for this, right? People have voluntarily led them through market democracy, which I've already said I don't think is much different from normal democracy, right? You're essentially letting them decide how the country is going to be run according to their whims. So what you've set up is what is essentially, in my opinion, direct democracy, right? You have people voting for people based on what they produce. For the difference is they're producing rather than just voting for a government, which would normally do nothing, right? But you have people voting, right? And whoever gets the most votes, right, gets the most money, and then whoever has the most money gets to decide what moral law is going to be, according to your argument against, the idea that stupid people would just rule a country under anarcho-capitalism, right? So
okay, well,
I'll let you.
Do you have anything more?
Well, I was just going to say, I'll let you continue. I mentioned some other stuff, but I don't think it's relevant to that specific point.
Okay, I'll respond to that really quickly because I'll refine my argument a little bit, right? Because you're right in pointing out that it's not just going to be the rich who have the most money who will get the most votes necessarily. It's really who has the most, who does the most spending. And this is often brought up in a case when people think anarcho-capitalism is just going to be a dictatorship of the rich, which it necessarily wouldn't be. There would be the poor sort of middle class who make up the majority of the spending in the economy who would also be deciding as well. But then again, they're not necessarily the dumb or unproductive people. They're just the middle class. So again, it's not like it's not like they're being unproductive or they'd be leeching off society. They're still producing something. They're just not necessarily the big business moguls. So it would be somewhat proportionate to not only how much you earn, but also how much you spend.
Okay.
And so that play.
Okay, so that makes sense to me actually. Okay, but the question I want to ask then, right, is you're saying, okay, so dumb people are not going to have control. Like firms are going to be more interested in helping people with more money, and thus they're going with people that have more money and more productive and are more productive. Firms are going to have, more interest in them because there's more incentive. I don't know. I'm not being very clear because I'm tired, but I hope that point is across, right? But if you're saying that the market is going to stop rich people from deciding, what ethics are going to be, right? Then we're back down to this base, right, where you have the market or what is essentially the collective, because the market is the sum of it's the quote unquote sum of the operations of every individual in the society, right, including the dumb people, right? You are going to have a collective voting, right, for somebody, okay, who gains more money and thus gains the interest of the firms, right? And then if they stop liking that person, right, they'll just start propping up the productive abilities of another person, right? So you can say that no rich person will ever be able to, control the ethics of the society, right? Because I'm saying this is circular, right? You're saying the market will prop up individuals, right, who will become productive. Firms will become interested in those people, right? And then you're saying if those people, are shitty at their job, the market will then destroy them, right? So you're going back and forth between saying it's a democracy and then saying that it's, philosopher kings, and then back to democracy when that gets shitty, and then philosopher kings again when that gets shitty. And I'm saying you can't have both, right?
Well,
Either you have to admit it's democracy, because the democracy will still control, who the philosopher kings are going to be, or you have to say that it's going to be philosopher kings because the philosopher kings will control what the firms are going to do, right?
Okay, so I guess it may seem contradictory on surface, but this is actually a concept I got into a debate about with someone else, another Ancap actually. It would essentially be, and I know this may sound odd, but this would essentially be an electoral dictatorship, like essentially where the consumer, the voters, essentially imbue someone, in this case the business boss, with the most power, and essentially instead of having a coup to overthrow this dictator, you just choose to spend your money somewhere else. So you do have a dictator in a sense, but at your will you can overthrow this dictator bloodlessly and effortlessly, essentially, because you're just choosing how to change your spending habits as opposed to actually taking up arms or anything along that line. So you're right, it would be the philosopher kings and the democracy at the same time. In fact, it'd probably be what could be said as the best of both worlds, really. You have people deciding what they want as a sort of democratic method, but at the same time, you have the efficiency of one dictator and one ruler who's able to make all these decisions. And it wouldn't even be necessarily one ruler. You could prop up multiple business leaders at the same time. There would be competing firms, of course, and there would really be, the chance of monopoly existing would be very, very little. And that's another conversation we could get into if you want. But I think let's just
let's avoid that. Let's avoid that for now, right? Because I think we are getting somewhere. But I think the issue again is that if you have, so you're saying, okay, I just want to make sure that I'm clear. You're saying that the market would prop up quote unquote dictator. He's not really a dictator because his power is limited, obviously, right? By the market if he does some shitty stuff, right? So you prop up this guy, right? But see, then the standard of what shitty is, right? What being immoral is, right? Is still reliant on the collective that voted him in, right? They're only going to stop buying his shit and propping him up, right? If they think that he's being immoral, right? So what I'm saying is that you still haven't transferred the burden, right, of deciding what morality is onto the businessman. It's still on the collective because, or not the collective, but the market, right? Because the market is what is going to, what is good, right? It's still going to be decided by the market, right? And this guy, this dictator, is going to be elected on the basis of what the market thinks is good, right? So yeah, if you have many dumb people voting, like in any democracy, right, buying this guy's stuff, right, they're not going to stop buying it if they're all communists and they think this guy's doing communist stuff because they like that, or if they're all fascists, or if they're all etc. Or if you have multiple firms or multiple people buying multiple things from different businessmen, like let's say you have one really rich businessman that owns a railroad and lots of fascists use that railroad, right, and he's doing some fascist stuff, they're not going to stop buying his shit, right? So you have to, if you want, like, you haven't transferred the burden of the deciding morality on these individuals who produce. It's still on the collective, it's still in the group. Dumb people can still fuck up the society and destroy natural rights. And I think I am a libertarian in every aspect except when it comes to the use of force. I think the market is more productive in everything. I think schools should be privatized, roads should be privatized. But when it comes to morals, and when it comes to specifically the use of force, it can't be privatized, because having privatization everywhere else and having a market in the first place where people can trade and not have to worry about ethics that allow for people to use force against each other.
Well, let me before you just go on
you get my point. Yeah, you get my point.
Yeah,
I'll let you continue. Yeah.
So I think you're conflating morality with efficiency here, and I'll explain why. It's because the business owner isn't necessarily going to get, or people aren't going to stop buying his product because he's a crappy person. People are going to stop buying his product because he's being inefficient about it. He's jacked up prices to an unreasonable level, or maybe there's some crappy practice that he's engaging in and it's costing him more, or something else. And I think, as I've already said, what will be most efficient inevitably is the preservation of natural rights, like, not treating your workers like crap, and not doing all these things. It's going to be the preservation of natural rights which will be most efficient. And so whether these people have crappy ideas or not is irrelevant. What is efficient is what is efficient. And I think we can all agree that natural rights are going to be most efficient. And so whether stupid people realize it or not, they're going to tend towards efficiency. Thomas Sowell actually has a great example of this in one of the books I'm reading by him. It's called Markets and Minorities. And he talks about slaves being freed from slaves. I mentioned this in my last stream. I'm finding a way to bring it up everywhere. But it's, even though the slaves were completely illiterate, could do no math, could do nothing whatsoever to really consciously improve their economic situation, first, formerly their slave owners started to hire them. They were trying to undercut them at every turn. But it was impossible for all the sharecroppers to charge one single low price simply because they couldn't all consult each other across the former Confederate states. And so eventually the former slaves realized where the pay was better, and they all started to go work for that sharecropper. And he got more productive work, and he got higher profits because of that productive work. And then other sharecroppers realized, hey, if I want to get the former slaves to come work for me, I better jack up rates too, so I could hire the best quality work. And that happened. And then the slaves moved to that sharecropper, and the process repeated itself across the entire former Confederacy. And so what Thomas Sowell actually notes happening in that time period is that the wages of the former slaves rose faster and higher than any other ethnic group in the United States in all of its history up to that point. And so whether or not you have dumb people is it's almost irrelevant to the fact that efficiency is efficiency, and no matter how dumb you are, it will come out. And because we've agreed, I believe, that natural rights will be most efficient, natural rights will eventually win out. I think that's the case to be made for that.
Okay. So these people who are propped up by being productive, these businessmen, I thought that they would attract the interests of the firms that govern law. So wouldn't their ideas of what morality would be, like, it would be relevant in an anarcho-capitalist society, because they're going to have the money to fund their moral positions if they're more productive. You kind of get what I'm saying?
I kind of do. So let me tell me if I'm wrong here. What you're trying to say is that it'd be the firms propping up, it'd be the businesses propping up these firms, and these businesses would be catering to the interests of these people, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And the businesses would be catering to the interests, obviously, of the businessmen who own them, who might have their own moral kind of ideas. And these kind of problems where you have
hold on,
different.
What was that second statement? I didn't quite get that. I didn't quite understand what you're saying.
No problem. And so the businessmen are also going to have personal interests in morality, whether they're right or wrong, right? So you could have, the perfect businessman who is, really efficient, and he treats his workers well because he knows it will, net him more, social good publicity, or whatever reasons, right? He's the perfect businessman. But let's say personally he believes in a fascist morality, right? He's more wealthy. So he's going to have more influence with these firms in propping up that moral stance, right? That's just an example, right? And these types of issues in general, whether it is the groups of dumb people that are, supporting these firms in propelling these kind of stupid moral perspectives forward, or whether it's rich people who are doing it, or whether it's, whatever, right? When you don't have an objective set of ethics in place by a government, these types of issues, I see them as inevitable, whether they're from businessmen or whether they're from groups of people who come together that believe in the same thing, even if they're poor, right? And individual interests cannot reign in the market of ethical ideas. I think that's really dangerous for a free market, right? So I think what your position is it can't be a free market unless you have absolute freedom in every aspect, including morality. And my position is that we require an objective set of law, of force in morality and behind it, in order to have a free market at all, because otherwise anybody can support firms or gangs or different governments that they form to back up whatever moral law they want, including the businessmen you mentioned, including the dumb people we were talking about for a while. I think that's fundamentally the general issue, right? And then you have to come up with all these theoreticals, right? Okay, well then you have this court defending this certain thing, and then each would be in the productive interests of each, And I think this is all. Yeah, I'll let you go because I think you understand. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I'll let you continue.
What I would say to that is that, excuse me, let me get my thoughts together. Well, the firm is also a part of the business venture. Excuse me, of the businessman. He wouldn't be able to prop up any firm of its own independent interest just off of the proceeds he makes from his business, because he needs to reinvest that back in his business, unless he had some.
But he would have an influence.
Oh no, he would still have an influence, undoubtedly. But the firm would still need to be its own private venture, even if it was oversought by him. And so for that firm to be profitable, it would have to be contracted under, and again, it would have to be something people agreed to. And so people could agree to have certain rights abridged again, and we go back into the issue of battling private courts. But as I think I've already said, it's just a matter of time. If one firm breaks its contract, do business with it, the people under it, even if they think it represents its interests, will through even some sort of unconscious knowledge somehow recognize that because they've broken their contract, it is now not an economically good venture for them.
Wait, pause. Can you elaborate on unconscious process? Because that confused me.
Well, it's kind of like the unconscious process I just mentioned with the slaves. They were totally illiterate. They couldn't do math. They couldn't understand, really much of what was happening prior or after their freedom. Yet they managed to somehow increase their wages astoundingly at an amazingly quick rate.
Okay,
for
so
what could only be described
by
as
unconscious process, you're basically just referring to, I guess, what Adam Smith would say, the invisible hand.
Yeah, it'd essentially be
so market forces.
Yeah, like market forces don't require rationality necessarily, because going well for you, you want it to stop. And when people break their contracts, people don't do business with you, and it affects you because it kind of goes back to the same argument that the markets, people will feel the effects of market forces negatively. And what's proven the best, I should say, in market is when natural law is followed. Natural law is the most efficient. Yeah, I feel like we've been having this conversation a bit.
I agree. We've repeated the same point again, and I think what I'm not getting across, perhaps, is that my issue with market forces is it requires a market to operate, and this market is naturally, the sum of it's summed up in a price usually. It's the sum of the interests of a certain society or group of people, right? And since the market is reliant on the interests of people in it, and that's what makes it so great. The market operates on the interests of each individual inside of it, right? It makes it bad for the use of force and etc. Because you can say that it will be objectively beneficial if everybody follows these rights, which are true, and it will be more efficient. But the fact of the matter is, if the market has an interest which is not aligned with these natural laws, then these natural laws following them will not be in their interests, and the market will operate differently, right? So if what is efficient for the market, well, if what is efficient for the market is reliant on the interests of the people in it, right? So if I want potatoes, right, the market will change to be more efficient in getting me potatoes, right? If I want communism, right, in a society where you have no government, right?
Okay,
the market
I see
will
what
adapt.
you're doing here.
See what I'm saying, right? So
it's okay, so I'll raise this objection to that, because I see what you mean now. And the thing is, it's different with ideologies that have practical implications as opposed to goods or services. The marketplace of imposition of will is much different than that of goods, because wills have effects on other people, respond far more quickly when they realize the negative implications than when they realize they might not be getting X good that they have. Like, the effect is far more immediate and far more reaching. And so people will be prone to realize the negative effects that we know already exist of, say, fascism, of, say, white supremacy, of, say, communism. These are all negative effects that, when pushing for this ideology, other people will see far more quicker than if they were just, say, deprived of a certain good over a period of time. And that will prompt that system to fail much more quickly than it would if, say, there was a monopoly on, say, a certain kind of good. So ideas are much more potent in how they affect people than, say, the lack of a good or the lack of a service. And that's what will eventually undo any firm that tries to impose that system, even if it is consensual.
Okay, but that is reliant, right, on the premise that the rest of the market, right, leans against the specific wishes of the part of the market that is advocating for communism, right? So what I'm saying is that the market operates on the individual interests of everybody in it. If I want communism, right, the market will lean towards my interests, and then you're saying the rest of the market that doesn't want communism will react, right? But your assumption...
Well, yeah, this is something... Well, I don't think this is an assumption at this point. At this point, it gets into the realm of actual economic science, where communism just isn't a system that's going to work. And even if the whole globe were to suddenly go communist, the economic calculation problem would set in.
Let's assume anything else then. Let's assume that it's white supremacy or something that isn't necessarily something that would affect the monetary interests of other people, right? If I demand firms that protect a white supremacist ethics, right, and the market leans away from me, right, then it's perfect. Okay, you're absolutely right, right? But what if the market leans towards me? What if other individual interests lean towards me? Then it will be more efficient to people with that interest, right, to have a market that adapts to that specific moral code, right? So when you have an adaptive market, which is natural in any economic system, right, because it operates according to the interests of individuals in it, and you have a majority of people, or even, it doesn't even have to be a majority, it can be a third, it can be a good chunk of them, right? That's all you need, right? The market will adapt to those interests, and the efficiency, right, will be according to the standard of people with that interest. So if I'm interested in communism, or it's not communism, white supremacy, if I'm interested in white supremacy, white supremacist firms, right, and their growth will be more efficient because that's where my interests are, right? And same for every other white supremacist in the market, right? So if your assumption is that, I think you get my point. You understand. I'm assuming you'd understand what I'm saying.
So, so this interest would only affect areas which I'd say are predominantly white. That being because that's the only way you're going to appeal to, white supremacists, supposedly.
Yeah. Assume
and
that.
So,
yeah. Okay. Sure.
That's not a universal. Yeah, that's not a universal business model. So obviously there are other firms that are going to appeal to a multicultural, so to speak, aspect of defense. And because there's a demand for those firms, they will pop up as well. And so obviously in this white supremacist society, you're only going to have white people who choose to live under this defense firm. And that's really the only way you're going to get something like that. And in that sense, nobody is really harmed by that, because only white supremacists are living under there, and they're not really going out of their way to exert their will on other things, because it's kind of like this covenant community where the only people there are the people who want to be there. And so if that's the case, there will be economic ramifications, though, because obviously there are going to be some skilled African-American or Latino workers who they're missing out on, and they will economically suffer, maybe not to the same extent as communism would be, but
they'd
also be a process of...
They'd economically benefit as well, because you're forgetting the fact that the market operates on the interests of people inside of it, right? So like, it's not like there's an objective standard to a market, right, as to what is beneficial to it. And
the firm itself might be doing well, but
yeah,
the
firm
society that
yeah.
the society that firm is living under will be losing a lot of comparative advantage that it might otherwise be benefiting from through trade with non-whites. And so that society which is hiring that firm is eventually, or well, they may be able to survive without being without doing trade with these other non-white groups, but they'll never be able to be as economically efficient as those who would do business with them otherwise. And so their influence will be highly limited. And it's highly doubtful that they would survive, quite honestly, because most of the world is non-white, quite frankly. And so they're losing out on such a massive amount of comparative advantage. It'd be hard to see that they survive for any significant period of time.
And would you okay, so let's say there are some black people in this territory that the firm operates under. Your assumption is that actually, I'm not going to make any assumptions about what your views on it would be, but let's say these white people think that letting these black people go isn't the right thing to do. We're just going to, enslave them, kill them, etc. Right? Would you say that another firm would then intervene in this firm's kind of actions and try to fight them? Or would you say a group of firms would group together and try to fight them and stop their kind of their tyranny? Or would each firm kind of have like a non-interventionist kind of thing where they're not going to involve themselves in the ordeals of other firms? That kind of confuses me. And before I continue, and what differentiates this from the kind of idea that each of these firms are just governments, and that the only difference is that they're consensual governments. They're objectivist like consensual governments. The difference being that they just have shitty moralities. All
right, so I'll answer that in kind of chronological order. I'll start with the first thing, that is, let's say, there was an overwhelming non-white minority in this area that chose to enforce territorial white supremacy, and say now they want to strip the rights of those people.
It could even be one. It could be one black guy in this whole area.
Yeah, essentially signed on to that contract. So obviously, they would be violating his NAP, quite honestly. That's a violation of NAP.
Yeah, of course, I agree with you. Yeah.
What happened there is he could seek an outside firm. Obviously, because he's not, because that firm is choosing not to protect him, to leave, and they couldn't chase him because they would have no jurisdiction outside of his territory. Now, obviously, that would be kind of crappy, but well, see, the thing is about a firm, if he stays on his private property, what he already owns, then they can't really encroach. They can't really encroach on him without him.
Who's going to stop them?
Well, he can stop them for one, and he can come in contact with other firms. You're right. He would reach out to another firm and they would act on his behalf, or he would reach out to a private court. He could reach out to something. He has options. So
would a different firm say that it's worth the economic risk to come in and declare war on this other firm in order to save this minority, these few individuals, this group that's under tyranny? Because once you introduce these interests, right, these market interests to the use of force and to morality, you encounter issues like that.
No, you're right. You do, and I see where you're going with this. Where would it be economically efficient? And if the answer is no, would they just let his rights be violated? And of course, I'm not going to sit here and pretend like they wouldn't. In some cases, there would be cases where human rights violations would be allowed. Now, what I would say about this in this instance is that happens regardless of what government you have. Like, even if you were to have a federal government of the nature you're proposing, it's not impossible that human rights violations happen under it. What anarcho-capitalism has always been built on is that, we're not going to solve all of the world's problems in a set period of time. We're just the most efficient system at solving them. And so while you're right, human rights violations like the type you just mentioned would still definitely occur. I'm not denying that it could be a possibility in some hypothetical situation that could become realistic, but it's just far less likely under the system, and it's not the most likely situation because of market forces. I guess I'm kind of falling back on here.
Okay, so in a nation, right, where there's a single government with a monopoly of force and it's contractual taxation, right? which means that maybe I shouldn't call it taxation, but it's a mutual
Payment
agreement,
collection,
right?
so to speak.
Sure, yeah, sure, right. In that situation where this kind of single government is big enough that it can stop other firms from becoming operative, right? And that is in the contract, right? Which with every single person that signs in the contract is that with this payment you give us the right to protect your interests by stopping the activities of other firms that might differ in ethics, right? Why would there be more likelihood of human rights violations in a system like that, where it's contractual, where it's mutual, where there is a single government with an objective set of laws, with a constitution, an American-like constitution that acts in accordance perfectly with an app, right? I'm lost in how you can say that would be less effective in preserving human rights than a system where you have multiple governments protecting the moral systems of various people, some which might be disgusting moral systems.
So in your system of monarchy, in your system of minarchy.
God, no.
Minarchy.
Yeah.
My brain went autocorrect for a second there. But in your system of monarchy, in which there's contractual taxation, I'm still assuming that you're advocating for some kind of democracy, yes?
You mean in terms of who is going to run this private firm?
In terms of who you're having to run your government, quasi-government, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. It would be a form of democracy in that. So it would. I don't advocate for democracy in the sense of tyranny rules kind of thing, right? I advocate for democracy given the fact that there is a contractual constitution, right, where whoever runs the government doesn't have the ability to basically operate in a way that would make the democracy relevant, right? So democracy is relevant if people can vote away the rights of another person, right? But if there is a constitution which limits the government's power to the extent that they can't do that, then democracy is kind of irrelevant because it's impossible for democracy to violate the rights of other people. You can't have a majority of people vote away the rights of another people because the government in power is contractually obliged not to do that by the payment of each individual person.
Well, inherent in the system of democracy is essentially you imposing your will in one way or another on someone else, whether you like it or not. In the sense that
I'm fine with that if they disagree with the objective set of natural law. I'm completely fine with forcing my will on another person. If they want to kill another person, if they want to steal, I would actually
we're not
advocate
just
for
talking
that.
violations of the NAP here, because inherent in the system of the democracy is that you will be able to vote in someone and they will be able to pass laws eventually. It's just a flaw of democracy where you will be able to vote away rights. Otherwise, you don't really have democracy. Because democracy is majority rule.
Maybe I wouldn't call it democracy. Maybe I wouldn't call it democracy. Maybe there would be some kind of there would be a democratic-like process, maybe a safety check to make sure that whoever's running this governmental group isn't absolutely insane or can at least basically.
So there'd be like a violent revolt clause, is essentially what you're saying.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. You're right. So the premise is, you need the democracy to a certain degree, just as then you need guns in a society so people can overthrow, a shitty government. Right. It's the same kind of
assuming
premise.
Assuming that the only reason you'd overthrow a shitty government is because it's violating human rights, there you go. Inherent in your system is the ability to violate human rights, and the only way you yourself are admitting it would be overthrown is through violent revolution. Now, what I'm proposing is that when you privatize that risk of the, revolution and the, different firms going to war, you make it that much less cost effective, because even if you have voluntary taxation, people are still contractually bound to pay those taxes to the tyrant, even if they didn't vote him in, even if they disagree with his rule, so to speak. Until the revolution begins, you're still contractually bound to pay those taxes, even if you disagree with his policies. And up until the moment of the revolution, he will still have access to those funds. And then if it degrades into civil war, he'll have access to the funds of the area he has control of. And so really there's just that much more.
I actually like this train.
To take power.
I like your train of thought here because you're kind of using my own argument against your kind of democracy, kind of market democracy, against my political democracy, which is it's a good way to do it, right? I'm trying to think of a way around it. Perhaps there is a flaw in the idea that there would be a democracy which would work to kind of put people in charge or overthrow the shitty kind of minarchy, right? But then in that case, I might have to resort to saying that perhaps taxation is necessary for freedom. That violation of freedom is necessary for further freedom, because the only way you can have an objective set of laws is if it's objectively enforced, right? So I'm not willing to basically say that anarcho-capitalism is valid as a result of the argument against democracy you've made against me, because I still think my arguments against democracy, against your kind of political philosophy, is just as valid. But you've actually potentially made me more statist now, because I think now that I'm thinking about it, perhaps freedom, in a sense, is you need a government funded by taxation in order to have a free market.
I haven't made you more statist. I have only made you realize your own statism.
But yeah, that's true. Maybe you're right. Yeah.
Well, I'll ask. I think we've kind of reached the natural conclusion of this whole discussion here. So I'll just ask Connor, who's been marvelously silent. I'm so sorry we've excluded you, Connor. Do you have any? Well, before we go, do you have any other points you'd like to make, and we can discuss that for a little bit?
Not really. I've been happy listening. Didn't really want to butt in on both of y'all's trains of thought. But one comment, I guess, to Evan with regards to taxation. There are certain types of taxation, I think, that are, I guess, better than others, more acceptable. For example, you could have a minarchy purely funded on sales tax.
Well, yeah, definitely, yeah. You would have to,
rather than income, because income tax is directly taking from the money you earn, while sales tax on, well, I guess I should say sales tax on non-essential items such as food, shelter, and that kind of thing. You're not forced to buy that television that's being taxed, but so it's not directly taking from the money you earn without any say on your part.
Yeah, I agree. That's definitely true, and I think you're absolutely right. Sales tax would be the best way if taxation would be the necessary way to have a free market, which I'm kind of thinking about now. I need to sort this out kind of through mental exercise now somehow. Maybe on the bus ride to school tomorrow, I'll do it.
Well, you know what? Rothbard does make a case about sales tax, but I'm willing to leave. I won't make that case now. I'm willing to leave you guys with the last word on it, and I think we can just end that here. Are we good on that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
All right. So cool. Thanks for talking with me, guys.
No problem.
Yeah, thanks. I've probably gained more from listening, but yeah.
Gain knowledge. All right. See ya.